So as Joe said, welcome everyone to the Active Transportation Funding Overview webinar, one of many interactive technical assistance events being offered through PlanIt Education and Training Program to planners, consultants, elected officials, and technical staff as local governments prepare to begin comprehensive plan updates. My name is Gabriela Vera Suare. I'm a planner with Local Planning Assistance at the Met Council, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we start, we're going to go over some housekeeping that has been pasted into the chat. Today's webinar is being recorded, and feel free to turn on live captions within Teams. There are some instructions in the chat on how to do that. And we will be sharing a link to the webinar after the event. We'll welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. Feel free to raise your hand or enter a question in the chat throughout today's presentation, and our speaker will be happy to answer. We will also have dedicated time at the end of the presentation for some more questions and discussion. Today's event, as you all know, will be led by Joseph Whiting, Senior Transportation Planner and Active Transportation Program Manager. Joe has worked on developing the Active Transportation Program and solicitation and is now leading the program. Previously, Joe has worked for municipalities in the region working on street design and comprehensive planning, and for MnDOT on system and investment planning. So I will now turn it over to Joe to kick off his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Gabby. So yes, my name is Joe Whiting. I am here with the Met Council of MTS, and I am the new Active Transportation Program Manager. We'll be given an overview of the Active Transportation solicitation with an emphasis on the planning grants and the connection to the comprehensive planning aspect that all communities will be working on over the next couple of years here. So an overview of today's presentation. So first we'll give a brief background on the Active Transportation solicitation in general, just give you an idea of where this is coming from. We'll look at the solicitation itself, specifically the planning application category, looking at ways to connect the solicitation with comprehensive planning, and then finally some additional resources for developing plans or developing applications for the planning category before going over the next steps and kind of what to expect for the solicitation this year and when projects are to be awarded and announced later this year, early next year. First, we'll do a little brief background here to give an understanding of kind of where this funding and solicitation is coming from and how this connects then to what we're doing today. So in 2023, the state legislature provided a new source of active transportation funding at the regional level through the new sales and use tax. So in 2023, they passed that new transportation bill, which included a 75-cent regional sales tax, the 7-county metropolitan region. Of that new sales tax, the Met Council receives 83% of that tax, and of that 83%, 5% of that is dedicated and allocated to the Transportation Advisory Board for the purposes of active transportation. This funding is distributed by the TAB, but as the TAB does not have their own staff, it is something managed by Met Council staff, so in both planning and our grants department will be managing the program and the grants as they move forward. Additionally, the remaining 17% of that sales tax was dedicated towards our county partners, so Hennepin, Ramsey, Anoka, Washington, Dakota, Scott, and Carver, to receive that remaining 17%. And of that 17%, about 41% of that is then also required to then be spent on active transportation or transportation corridor studies at the county level. Counties are still identifying those different uses of those funds, but just want to mention that as there's a whole new universe of active transportation funding in the region, both here at the TAB and at our county partners. So this is the relevant 2023 session law language that actually enabled this new sales tax. As I like to point this out, this included 7 key requirements that we at the council had to incorporate into both the solicitation, project selection, and then also the evaluation management of projects as well. And one key here I just want to highlight, and I've highlighted here specific to planning, is one of the requirements that we needed to include in the infrastructure category. So if you're applying for funds to build projects, is a project's included in a municipal or regional non-motorized transportation system plan. And so that's really the nexus of where this new planning category came from in the active transportation solicitation, as policymakers really wanted to be sure that communities without plans in place have an opportunity to develop and set those plans in place so then they can come back later and apply for infrastructure funding to implement those plans. And so this is a key aspect of this planning consideration here, so I want to point that out as kind of why we're here today talking about this new active transportation solicitation for planning. So again, a little more background context of the full regional kind of thinking of funding for active transportation in 2026 here at the Met Council and TAB. So we have a regional sales tax, so which is again TAB, the Transportation Advisory Board ranks, selects, and actually and awards those active transportation projects. They are managed here by the Met Council, and sales tax collections began in October of 2023. So session law language signed in 2023, and collections actually began a little later in October of 23. It's initially estimated to provide about $24 million annually for active transportation. Real revenue we've seen for the first for 2024 and 2025 has been a little lower than that, about 21 million. We are expecting that to continue to increase throughout the decade, but just know that we have seen a little lower revenue than we initially anticipated from that 23 bill. The regional funding side here, so 2026 will be our first active transportation solicitation. So this is really the first go of this for here with this new source of funding. So there'll be about $50 million available for local pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure and planning projects, and we'll be awarding funding for projects in 2027, 2028, and 2029. So more immediate projects. So if you've got planning, obviously you can get going as soon as you get the award, but other sorts of projects, more sooner projects are anticipated to be applying for this new funding as the funding is already available. On the federal side, there is still federal funding for bicycle projects in the 2026 regional solicitation. There'll be about $35 million available for bicycle projects on the regional network. So that's our RBTN and our regional trail network. And these will be awarding funding for the 2030 and 2031 years. So a little further out in years there, as typically federal projects are. I do have links for both the regional station and the active transportation program here as well. This presentation will be sent out after this meeting, so you can click all the links here. And I do believe we also had that master list of all the various links I'll be sharing throughout this presentation. So next we'll be moving on. We'll be talking specifically about the 2026 active transportation solicitation with that emphasis on the planning category. But first things first here on the project category funding details. So there will be three categories in the active transportation solicitation: our local bicycle facilities, our local pedestrian facilities, and our active transportation planning category. So you can see here the target funding for 26. Most of this funding will be targeted for infrastructure. 48 million of it will be for those local bike and pedestrian facilities categories, and 2 million of it will be dedicated for the planning category. So I note that these are targets, so they don't necessarily aren't going to be hard numbers. So if we get a lot of really good applications in the planning category, we may go beyond that 2 million. So just keep in mind that's a target, not a hard number. So if it's ends up a little more, we potentially could be funding more projects than that 2 million, but it is the target funding for the source. And you can see here the minimum award there is no minimum award, so these planning projects could be small, up to $200,000 for the maximum award for planning projects. Also note here we have our regional bicycle facilities category, that federal category, with the minimum maximum million to 5.5 million, so a little bigger than our local projects, and that is because they're larger in scale and federal funding is generally more complicated. A few other policy level details that I want to point out here that are relevant for our purposes here today. So one thing that the TAB really wanted to be sure of is not to commingle funds. I'm sure as we're aware, federal funds are not always something that you can be guaranteed about, right? Administrations change, priorities change, potentially project funding could be taken away. And so our TAB wanted to be sure that our local funds are locally sourced and locally used, and they're not going to be mingled with federal funds, which may be jeopardized at any moment. So that's why these two categories came from. So either you're going to be applying for your local projects or you're going to be applying for federal projects. You can't apply for both in the solicitation itself. So something you should be thinking about if you're applying for projects. If you want to apply for that local funding, you only be applying for the local funding. There is going to be no local funding match for any of the active transportation funded categories. So that's both your infrastructure and planning. So if you have a $200,000 project and you're applying for $200,000 of planning fund, all that money can go to your project. You don't need to identify local sources to supplement that grant award. So a big difference from our federal awards, which typically require a 20% match. There will be no local match requirements for the active transportation projects. In addition, for our infrastructure projects, so it's our local bike pedestrian facilities, the design and engineering of selected projects will be eligible for funding. So if you're applying for those projects and you maybe just have a kind of a concept on the map, you will be able to utilize these funds to develop and engineer that concept before actually constructing it as well. So again, another difference from our federal projects, which generally do not allow design and engineering to be eligible for federal funding, that is eligible for local funding in 26. One key note here I do want to point out is geographic balance. So the tab is made up of policymakers from all around the region, and they do reserve the right and the ability to consider geographic balance when making final project selection decisions. So this is a regionally sourced sales tax from all 7 counties, and so this is something that they are considering when they're making their final project selection later this year. So just something to consider if you're in a community that maybe has a lot of projects applied here. You might not get all those funded because they are going to be considering geographic balance and making those decisions. So just something to keep in mind as you're thinking about applying for projects this year. Next, we're going on to eligible project types. So this is specific to our planning category.
Quickly.
Oh, yep.
Sorry. If you turn off your camera, I think your audio should improve.
Okay.
It's just a tiny bit choppy. Yeah.
Okay.
Right,
Thank you for that. Yeah, the iPhone is not so strong. Appreciate that. So looking at our eligible projects for 2026. So this is, again, specific to planning. One thing that we wanted to emphasize in this category, the TAP policymakers want to be sure that these are system plans. And so as we think about developing system plans to make projects eligible for funding, we are really focusing on system planning for this solicitation. So that's either a bicycle system plan, a pedestrian system plan, an active transportation system plan that takes both bicycle and pedestrian systems and combines into one plan, a small area or neighborhood active transportation plan. So if you say have a subset of your community that you need to maybe have a more robust planning effort for, that would be something eligible through this process. Safe routes to school plans, and also comprehensive planning support for the bicycle and pedestrian plan elements. We'll talk a little more about what that would look like in a little bit here. So non-eligible for 2026 is corridor or project specific planning. So that would be if you have a specific corridor that you're developing facilities for. You cannot apply for planning funding for that. However, as I noted, for those infrastructure projects, if you applied for construction, some of that funding could be utilized for the design and engineering of those facilities as well. So there's potentially a little bit of a gap here. We're not going to give every sort of type of planning project, but we're trying to be sure we capture as much as we can with that system level planning through this planning process, and then that more corridor level design in that infrastructure categories. Next, I want to talk a bit about eligible applicant types. So really, eligible applicant types run most types of applicants. So your public entities and your communities. Examples could be counties, cities, townships, American Indian tribal governments, other public agencies like school districts, universities, public park agencies, transit providers developing facilities that would connect to their transit facilities, and also nonprofit organizations as well. One key on those nonprofits, though, is they will need to partner with a public entity to apply. So say if you're a neighborhood organization and you're applying for maybe a neighborhood active transportation plan, you need to partner with the city in which your neighborhood is within to be eligible for funding. And so that's really to keep, be sure that these local nonprofits are really following and connecting with those communities that they're developing plans for, and also that there's an entity to help implement these plans once they are completed. One thing I want to note, communities may partner on efforts with other organizations or communities. So you have, a larger community within another community, and maybe they're both applying for active transportation system planning. If they wanted to say, do those plans jointly and combine those efforts with a single contractor, they could do so by combining those wards with each other. Another example here, again, those coordinated efforts, two adjacent communities, maybe you could apply for a bike share system planning. If they're both awarded funds, they could then combine those funds for one contract to develop a system plan for both communities. And so really want to be sure we're flexible here to ensure that we're not skipping on any types of projects or any sorts of scales of system planning that are eligible out there. Next, we'll talk about qualifying criteria. So qualifying criteria are items which applicants must meet to qualify for funding. So as you're applying for projects, you need to meet these to even be eligible to apply for projects. And I have the planning specific ones highlighted here, as the other ones here are more project specific, but on our planning side. So the project must be included in local planning or programming document. So that's something, again, that's kind of the nexus of why we have a planning category, is we need to have if you're applying for projects, you need to have that plan in place, and that project needs to be found in that plan or programming document to be eligible for funding. On the planning side, Applicants either must have no dedicated active transportation plan in place, so a pedestrian, bike, active transportation plan, or the plan is 10 years or older. So we either saying you have no plan in place or your plan's kind of old and it's time for an update. We want that. If your plan's 5 years old, you will not be eligible to apply for funding to update that plan quite yet. So that's something to keep in mind here. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the plan must address active transportation at a system level and can't be corridor project specific. So going beyond those qualifying criteria, so once you get past that first level qualifying criteria, next is our scoring measures. So as you apply for projects, you'll be answering these questions. These questions will be scored then, and then help our decision makers actually make decisions on selecting final projects. So we have 3 criteria here. So we really want to simplify the planning category questions to be really simple for applicants to be able to understand and apply for. So there's really just 3 main ones here. So that first one's that proposed planning effort. So identifying a project, and then also identifying any complete streets planning, design, or construction, which already occurs in your community or potentially could be helped by this planning process. Safety is really a key emphasis that our policymakers want to make in this listation. That's going to be a very big chunk of our award. 30% of your award will be, talking about safety and how this planning effort can improve safety in your community. And then finally, community considerations. It's really looking at that data engagement and potential project benefits for your community and kind of how those will be addressed through the planning process. Again, more links here. These will actually take you to the full criteria measures for each category here, but we won't go through those in super in depth. But I will kind of go into the planning questions a little more detail, give you some ideas of what to include if you're applying for planning in these categories, and kind of what to think about as you go into those applications later next month. So that measure 1 again is that project identification measure. So we're looking for applicants to describe the proposed project and how this project will advance active transportation in your community. So things to include, the type of plan. So you should be noting if it's comprehensive planning support, if it's a dedicated system plan, if it's a safe route to school plan, right? So be clear on what kind of planning you are proposing to do with this project. You should be identifying how the plan will be used. Will you be doing mapping? Will you be prioritizing projects? Will you be identifying local travel barriers? Will you be addressing safety issues in your community, right? So how is this plan going to be used once it's developed and implemented? If the plan is if you're applying for comprehensive planning support specifically, you should be explaining how the proposed plan would help the community meet minimum requirements and how it would help get that community more towards getting that more out of your plan elements. We'll look at those in a little bit, kind of tell you what those look like, but we should be, if you're applying for that comprehensive plan support, you should be really explaining how this is going to be helping you achieve that comprehensive planning aspect. We also should be looking at how the planning will help to advance complete streets development. So that's a legislative requirement, and so that's something we had to include here. So you should be thinking about in your application, if you have a complete streets policy in place already, how this plan will help to advance that. If you don't, how can this planning help you get to having something like that in place in your community? And also note if an existing pedestrian or bicycle plan exists, note the age of the existing plan. Remember, it's got to be 10 years or older. So if you have an older plan in place, just note that you have that in place since older than 10 years, you're okay, but just give the scores an idea of what to think about in context here. For comprehensive plan support, don't consider the 2040 plans as an existing plan in place. Those we will not necessarily be thinking about the same as a dedicated plan, and those won't be impacting the consideration as everyone had to complete a comprehensive plan for 2040. On the safety side, this is really looking at the safety approach for active transportation in your community and how this plan will advance that. So really describing how this planning effort and the plan will advance safety for those users in the community. Looking to incorporate, any safety data or any known issues in the community. So if you have known issues, you should be identifying those when you're applying, and saying how this plan will help address those. If it's existing safety planning work has already occurred in your community, note how the AT planning would incorporate or build upon that work already done. You should be noting how the plan will incorporate any safety recommendations and any safety considerations to be included in engagement for the plan. So as you think about your engagement and that safety aspect, think about how that how safety can be incorporated into your engagement plan. And finally, on the community considerations, as I mentioned, this is really about identifying your community and then identifying what you will be doing to engage that community through this process. So really looking to describe the plan to engage community and how the plan will advance greater understanding of specific communities within the project area. So really be sure to include, key data, demographic data, any key metrics about the community that, this planning will help inform and help build upon. Looking to identify your engagement approach, how will you engage, how engagement will be conducted and how targeted communities will be engaged. So really identifying, how will you be doing that engagement through the planning process. And then also think about what benefits for the community will be generated from the plan. How does this plan advance safety? How will this plan, advance active transportation use? How will this plan, help your communities towards active transportation? Also consider, developing any pedestrian or bicycle advisory committees to better connect active transportation planning and investments with community members. Not something we're going to necessarily you have to include, but that's something you should be thinking about, to better connect your community with your efforts for active transportation on an ongoing basis, right? We all know we do our planning processes and we get a lot of people interested in the process for that. But then, we also know they tend to die off once those planning processes are over. So, thinking about this as a long-term effort and something that should be continuing on, something like an advisory committee like that could help that. One more note on the solicitation itself. We will be utilizing a brand new grants management software this solicitation cycle. So it's called Flux. And so Flux is the new management software used by the entire council for all grants. So it won't just be us, it'll be housing, it'll be our cleanup grants, parks. Everyone will be utilizing Flux going forward. And so this is something to be familiar with. We're all learning and we'll all be continuing to learn through this process, but just something to note that we will have a new software. Web Grants is being retired. And I also want to note that all applicants will need to register to apply for funding. Even if you applied for funding in the past through Web Grants, again, it's new software, so you have to reapply and re-register with the new software before you actually can submit your applications. We will have additional workshops and trainings and how-tos going forward before the solicitation opens. I have a link here that's going to be our linked sheet as well. You can go there and see additional training opportunities. Do want to note, with Flux, all aspects and phases of a project will be handled within this new software. So the application, the review of the projects, the award notifications, the management of the grants and reporting, and also the project evaluation will all be handled within Flux now. So hopefully it'll be a more streamlined experience from start to end. But just want to keep everyone aware that it is brand new and we will probably have some growing pains. So next I want to move on and begin connecting the solicitation, so it's planning solicitation with our comprehensive planning process moving forward. This is our PlanIt training, so we do want to be sure we're connecting with our comprehensive planning. So first here, I'm going to talk about our minimum requirements for our bicycle and pedestrian elements of comprehensive plans and talk a bit about those get more to your plan elements as well. So on the bicycle side, there are more robust requirements for the minimum requirements for bicycle element here. And we're looking for communities to describe and map the full existing and planned bike network and potentially include any local bikeway connections to transit facilities if they're present in your communities. Looking for communities to describe plans, strategies, or policies to address connectivity gaps in the bike network. Looking for communities to describe and map any regional bicycle transportation network facilities within your community. So any of those lines or corridors for your community should be incorporating those in your mapping. And also to describe and map regional bicycle barriers and discuss how to address the need to provide new or improved crossings for these barriers. This is data available. We'll talk about that a little bit here, and just something you need to be incorporating in your plan. On the pedestrian side, so pedestrian element is brand new for 2050, and so this is something, again, why we're thinking about comprehensive planning support. It's a big new element we'll be required to include. So we're including a full pedestrian element of local transportation element in the comprehensive plan. In previous planning cycles, we've seen, maybe some discussion in the parks section or other sections of the plan. It's hard to review these and know, if they're actually what they're talking about specifically. So we're requiring this year to include a full element within the transportation element. That'll include describing plans or strategies to address connectivity gaps similar to bikes, mapping the existing network, and also identifying mapping any locally developed priority networks or areas. So if your community has a downtown or an area where you see a lot of pedestrian activity, whether that's seasonal or whether that's like game time or things like that, we are looking and hoping communities to incorporate those in their priority networks in their communities. On the get more out of your plan, so these elements will not be required for communities to include in their plans. We are encouraged to be utilizing and considering these as they develop their comprehensive plans, as we do believe they would make them more robust plans. We're looking for communities to potentially consider using bicycle data, tools such as MnDOT Space Tool and their upcoming impact tool to prioritize needs and planning within their communities and connect that with the comprehensive plan. Looking for communities to consider collecting bicycle use data So going out there and actually understanding, who's using your system, how are they using your system, and, to what levels are they using your system. And also for communities to identify and incorporate any regional high injury streets and their crash risk index for bicyclists from our regional safety action plan to incorporate that in their planning. Also look for communities to adopt bicycle policies that address bicycling needs as new development or redevelopment occur in your community. So, as you get new subdivisions coming, new redevelopments, how are you incorporating bicycle policies within those? And then we're also asking communities to think about assessing local barriers to travel too. We have our regional barriers, which are your large ones, your highways, your rivers, your railroad tracks, but there's also local barriers too that we aren't necessarily identifying at a regional level. So, on the local level, we're encouraging communities to think about those local barriers to travel as well as the regional barriers. On the pedestrian side here, similar get more of your plan elements here, but a little different here. We are looking for communities, if you have safe route school plans already adopted within your communities, integrate those into your pedestrian elements and integrate those safe and active travel to schools within your comprehensive plans, collecting pedestrian data similar to collecting bicycle data, assessing local pedestrian barriers similar to assessing those local bicycle barriers, adopting pedestrian policies for new or redevelopment in your community, and to utilize demand tools like MnDOT's pause tool and future Met Council tools for demand as well to help you really make a robust comprehensive plan element for your pedestrian element. Next, I'll be kind of moving over some expectations if communities are awarded funding, right? So this is like if you applied, you're awarded funding for comprehensive plan support, what are we expecting to see out of this process from our communities who are applying for this? So awarded funds must only apply to work done to complete the pedestrian and bicycle element of comprehensive. And so think of this as a supplement to your overall master contract for your comprehensive plan. It could be something utilized to help, make those more robust pedestrian and bicycle elements. When reimbursing work, you must be identifying that work related to development of those elements. So, when you're requesting reimbursements, you need to identify that, yeah, this is something that we did specifically for the bicycle pedestrian element, and that is reimbursable through that process. Also note that awarded funds cannot be used for agency staff time at this time. It's a complicated process, and so we're going to be requiring any reimbursable cost to be something through an invoice from a consultant or a contractor. Reimbursable work includes engagement efforts connected to pedestrian bicycle elements specific to the work performed, right? So that's the meetings you're holding, that's the actual work it takes to set the meetings up and things like that, not necessarily things like if you're providing food or daycare, things like that to incentivize community members to join. It's really for that work performed specifically. Any work performed for policy development for your pedestrian bicycle elements, any mapping and analysis, any document development itself, right, as you're developing the document. And then these could also be used to supplement the consultant contract, as I mentioned. And then so also now connecting to that minimum requirements to get more of your plan, if awarded funds to supplement comprehensive planning, obviously communities must meet those minimum requirements. And we also are encouraging communities really and requesting them to address those advisory guidance items to get more of your plan and make those make those elements of your plan more robust and to really help you then in the future when you're applying for projects to really be able to tie into that comprehensive plan element that you develop to get a higher score. You think about including policies and strategies to support active transportation in your community. You should be thinking about a prioritized list of projects for implementation. So, a list of, say, your top 10 projects, which you think you should be implementing first. It could be to identify future planning or needs to maintain the system, right? So how do you maintain the system in good repair over time? You should be considering incorporating local safety data. You should be considering developing year-round maintenance policies. So this is something that the legislative language does really have us recommend is including in project selection for our facilities categories. So thinking about that, how do you maintain your facilities year round? Think about considering complete streets planning or strategies to get another scoring measure in our facilities categories, and consider identifying key local destinations within your community. Another aspect that is in our facility scoring measures is identifying local destinations near projects. So if you can get that work done in your planning process, that will certainly help you later on as you apply for infrastructure funding. Now moving on to dedicated plans, I did want to note again, go over some of those types of plans that are eligible and kind of show some examples from those plans themselves. So as I mentioned, those active transportation system plans, so covering both bicycle and pedestrian systems together. We have the Bloomington Active Transportation Action Plan here as a good example of what that could look like. On the bicycle specific side, St. Paul has actually recently updated their bicycle plan, and that is a good example of a bicycle system plan. Pedestrian system plan, Richfield has recently updated their pedestrian plan as well. So another good example of a pedestrian specific plan. A good example here of a small area neighborhood plan. I couldn't find a whole lot of these, but actually St. Paul did just complete their West Side Bike Boulevard Action Plan, which is a really good example if you're thinking about, well, what could a small area plan or what could a neighborhood plan look like? I think the St. Paul West Side Bike Boulevard plan is really good. It's still a system plan, and it's the West Side neighborhood. It's the system to get that neighborhood bike boulevard system put together and implemented. And so thinking of that as a system level, while also a smaller geographic unit than say the whole city. Safe Routes School Plan, we'll be looking for those district-wide plans or potentially covering multiple schools. Edina has their Active Routes to School Comprehensive Plan, which covers all schools in the school district and how to get those schools connected to active transportation facilities. And then other system planning, I think bike share planning is out there. I know that's something people are considering. ITDP does have their bike share planning guide. I don't really have any examples of a good system plan for bike sharing to provide here, but there is some planning guides that help think about that as if you're applying for bike share planning. So similar to our comprehensive planning, these are what we expect out of this at a dedicated active transportation system plan. So I noted awarded funds cannot be used for agency staff time, so it's said to be used for a consultant contract. So communities should be, mapping the existing and planned networks. They may also identify facility types, right? If they're an off-road, on-road facility as a multi-use trail, as a dedicated bikeway, that's also something we encourage. Communities should be identifying local regional barriers to active travel modes. Communities should be identifying policies or strategies to support those modes in the community. Communities should be identifying prioritized list of projects for implementation, should be identifying future planning needs, should be to maintain the existing system, should be incorporating local safety data in addition to the other existing and relevant safety planning, should be identifying how communities will develop year-round maintenance plans, very similar to comprehensive planning lists. They should be considered complete streets planning and defining and identifying key local destinations within communities. So now we'll move on to resources for developing comprehensive planning. So I mentioned we got some best practices here. So these are just some ideas here. So Walk Friendly Communities has produced their planning and policy resources to help communities, think about as you're applying and if you get awarded funds, how to actually develop your plans. NACDO includes their best practices for bicycle planning and design. Federal Highways, a few more that maybe are a little, not so urban specific. They have their small towns and rural multimodal networks guidance that helps communities maybe that aren't, those urban core communities think about their networks and planning their networks. They also have a guidance on pursuing equity in bicycle and pedestrian planning. So how can you incorporate and think about equity as you're developing these plans? The Ohio DOT also has their own plan development, active transportation plan development guide. I wish MnDOT had one. I couldn't find one. I don't think they do, but Ohio DOT does it. I was looking through it. I think it helps. It'll help a lot. Think about, as you're developing your plan, as you're applying for planning, how should you be thinking about that with that process? Next, I'm going to go through a little bit high level of some of these tools available that I'd mentioned in those minimum requirements areas. We will have a future webinar that will go in more in depth with MnDOT staff, but I do want to just highlight some of these as you're thinking about, planning to apply or planning to, work with these tools to how they can actually help you do so. So MnDOT has what's called the PAWS tool, the Priority Areas for Walking score, recently updated last year. It helps communities identify where pedestrian needs are the highest, and it kind of ranks them in tiers from tier 1, highest priority, to tier 4, the lowest priority. It's really a good tool for prioritizing networks and identifying where facilities are needed most. And it's something you definitely could think about utilizing within your application, or if you get awarded funding within your plan itself too, to kind of identify those areas that need priority and maybe a little more need than other areas in your community. Similarly, MnDOT also has their SPACE tool, which is the suitability for pedestrian and cycling environment. SPACE really helps to understand where the built environment is most suitable for implementing active transportation infrastructure, where there's barriers, where there's gaps. This could be, should be used for prioritizing and understanding needs at a higher level and really understanding your system at that higher level. I will note too, as I noted earlier, MnDOT is developing a replacement of this called their Impact tool. It's anticipated to be released this summer. I've seen a preview of it already, and we'll be having more talk about that, I think, at a later date. But just know that there's going to be an even more robust tool available by MnDOT called the Impact tool. I don't know the acronym, what it stands for. MnDOT loves their acronyms, but that is coming soon, and that will be something we'll talk about more at a future webinar. On our council side, so we have other different types of data available that should be incorporated in comprehensive planning or any dedicated planning. And we have our regional bicycle transportation network, or the RBTN. So the RBTN is a regionally identified bike network that is helping to prioritize, where bike transportation makes the most sense within communities. It identifies and corridors. So an alignment is if you're a community with alignment, right, that's where that bicycle facility will be, planned to be going. The corridor allows for a little more flexibility in where a bicycle facility could go and within that corridor to kind of meet the idea of the RBTN, and it's a little less prescriptive. Both those are available for download or for looking at here with this interactive web map. So when you need to incorporate those into your networks, those are both available in GIS shapefile format and within the interactive web map. Similarly to the RBTN, the regional bicycle barriers was a kind of a companion element to the RBTN to identify regional level barriers. So think of really large barriers, highways, think of rivers, streams, railroad tracks. Those really just barriers to travel for bicycles and pedestrians for that matter. This is also available again in a web map format and also a GIS shapefile format to be incorporated into planning. This wouldn't necessarily, again, as I mentioned, this is more your regional level barriers. So if you have further local barriers, they're likely not going to be identified here, and something that you should be exploring in your community on its own. Looking at the safety data, so we have the Met Council has developed a few different safety plans over the last couple of years. We have our regional pedestrian safety action plan, and we have our transportation safety action plan, which came out after this. Both these planning efforts could definitely be incorporated and help your own safety planning in your own community. The regional pedestrian safety action plan identifies risk factors and countermeasures for pedestrian safety. It identifies kind of those corridors within each county and community kind of with the highest risk of safety for pedestrians specifically. It includes a static crash risk map that includes every sort of roadway, as you can see here, the example here, Hennepin County. We also have this data available on our data atlas. So the regional solicitation, as part of this, we developed a comprehensive data atlas to cover all data types, and our safety data is included of that too, and that will be available for download as well. So you can take that data and incorporate that either in your application or your planning process if you're awarded funds. Again, I want to point out a couple of example plans again here, just because we're thinking about, as we implement these plans, what are some good examples? MnDOT has their district bicycle plans. I have Fridley here, again, an active transportation plan, so a plan covering both pedestrian and bicycle systems. Minneapolis has their transportation action plan, which includes dedicated sections for bicycling and pedestrian systems. Edina has their active routes to school plan and their bicycle and pedestrian master plan, which again covers both modes. And Burnsville is another community that has developed a multimodal plan, which covers again both pedestrian and bicycling within their community. Again, I want to point out a few additional resources and training opportunities beyond this webinar here. So the data atlas, as I mentioned, is that aggregated regional data for informational purposes as you're developing applications. So you can incorporate those safety data, other data within that data atlas to help you develop those applications and afterwards to develop plans as well. There will be additional training opportunities that we have listed out here. So for the federal side, there will be a regional solicitation overview on April 28th. For the active transportation solicitation, which will include planning, but also the infrastructure categories, there will be an overview for that on April 30th. We will have a community consideration specific webinar, so those more engagement questions on May 4th. And additionally, after the solicitation is open on May 7th, we will be holding many virtual office hours. So regional solicitation staff, myself, Bethany, and a few other staff members will be available through May and June at different staff hours, and those are listed on the website to come in and ask questions as you're developing your applications. We also do have a dedicated support email as well. So if you have any questions that you're thinking about those applications, you can feel free to email this. Any of us will be getting this email. So it's the regional solicitation support at metc.state.mn.us. Any questions you have as you're developing your applications can come through there. But looking at the timeline, So as I mentioned, May 7th, the solicitation will be open for applications. So that's a couple weeks from now. It'll be open for about almost 2 months. So it'll be open until June 24th when the solicitation will close for applications. After the solicitation closes, projects will be scored through September. So July, September projects will be scored with our technical partners, which then lead us into project review and selection by the tab in fall and winter of 26. Likely notice of awards will come out early next year in January 27. Once you get your notice of awards for the planning categories, you should be thinking about developing those RFPs, working with our grant staff to execute grant agreements, as reimbursements can only begin as soon as grant agreements are executed. So thinking about that, if you're awarded funds, begin thinking about that moving quickly with those RFPs, or working with our grant staff to start executing those agreements. As I mentioned, there are some connected PlanIt trainings coming up that are really connected to this. So we are a regional bicycle and pedestrian data webinar. As I mentioned, it'll go more into detail on those tools that I kind of highlighted briefly here. We'll have MnDOT staff available to kind of talk more about the pause and space and impact tool. We'll have Met Council staff available to talk about the RBTN and regional tools and how those can be applied in your comprehensive planning. And then also the following day, we'll have a companion meeting where we'll be learning how to set up and rent and what are the factors to consider for pedestrian and bicycle counters. So we'll be out in the field outside. I think we will be at the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail overpass over Highway 62 in Edina. That we'll actually going out to set up a counter. We'll be talking about how to set these up, how to rent them, what are the things you need to think about as you're setting these up in your community with MnDOT staff again, and that'll be June 5th at 11 a.m. And then we will have a pedestrian planning specific webinar, more in depth on the actual minimum requirements in August of 26 to give you a little more information on how to think about that pedestrian section.